Not everyone mourned a child's marriage to a non-Jew, as Sholem Aleichem Stevia the milkman did, telling everyone that there was no more Chava, her name had been blotted out. Yet by the early 20th century, a revolution in the Jewish family was underway. Young Jews had begun to reject the centuries-old practice of arranged marriage and had begun to reject the parental authority that had maintained it. And they had started to find spouses of their own choosing and who suited their own tastes. And this turn to individual prerogative led increasingly not only to companionate marriages between young Jews, but also to intermarriage. And the growing tide of exogamous marriage in the late 19th and early 20th centuries became a frequent topic of debate among community leaders, rabbis, journalists, and the Jewish press. And if there was one thing that they could all agree upon, it was that these unions, these intermarriages, seemed to pose a direct and dire threat to the future of Jews, the Jewish family, and Judaism as a whole. And the fear was not only that individuals were leaving Judaism and taking with them any future offspring, and that should already give us echoes from our previous talk, but that, quote, intermarriage had assumed such proportions as to threaten the integrity of Judaism, end quotes. And from a demographic standpoint, some argued that intermarriage combined with low birth rates would over time result in the gradual disappearance of Jews as a people. And in response, certain Jews in Berlin and Paris set about confronting this perceived crisis of intermarriage and the demise of the Jewish family more broadly by launching social programs for young Jews to meet. And my talk today is going to focus on three specific ways in which they did this in Berlin and Paris from the 1890s to the early 1930s. And that was namely by organizing holiday and social balls, through youth movements, and by placing personal ads in the Jewish press. And these responses were far from traditional, and their use sheds light on two communities that had come to adopt modern modes of leisure and sociability, and developments in print media in order to solidify bonds among community members on the most intimate of levels. I will begin, however, with a brief overview of the realities and perceptions of intermarriage at the turn of the 20th century before turning to these solutions. And the rhetoric concerning the future of the Jewish family across Europe was frequently bleak and frantic. And depending on the reading, statistics did very little to calm the fears. First, there was little doubt that intermarriage in Germany was on the rise. Statistics were easy to find, even if they frequently contradicted. Part of that had to do with how they were assessed. But certainly what one saw over time is in Germany a consistent rise. In 1901, for instance, for every 100 endogamous marriages, there were 16.97 mixed marriages. By 1909, just a short 8 years later, the number had already risen to 25.36. The general consensus, despite these various questions about how they were collected or not, was that by 1933, a full quarter of Jews in Berlin had entered a mixed marriage. And it seemed to be that this was going to just continue and continue. And more men were marrying out than women. The situation, the statistical situation in France was a little more complicated because of the census data that they couldn't, they stopped collecting census data about religion in 1872. And so what we have is more guesstimates, I would say. Paula Hyman argues that the intermarriage rates were negligible, and she suggests, though it's impossible to know how she comes to this, an intermarriage rate of 14%. But regardless of the actual numbers that we can put our fingers on and perhaps fudge around with them, what seemed to concern commentators was not so much the absolute numbers or the relatively high rates of intermarriage in a given year, but the overall trend, which seemed to point to an unstoppable and exponential growth in mixed marriages. And the corresponding rhetoric that emerged then in the German and French Jewish press was thus pessimistic in tone and assessment, and authors in the press decried intermarriage and offered various diagnoses for what they described as an illness. Frequently, the decline in religious observance or religious sensitivities was cited as the underlying cause behind mixed marriages. Jews and Christians alike, one author complained, quote, no longer recognized any God, end quote. Secular tendencies were seen as having lessened the difference between Jews and Christians, who in any event were, quote, really neither really Christians or Jews, but simply modern. And for this reason, a strong religious self-awareness was seen as a sturdy dam against the very thought of marriage with someone of a different faith. Others faulted the very acceptance of intermarriage as a reason for its popularity. There were other commentators who offered gendered reasons for intermarriage. Accordingly, Jewish men were frequently blamed in the German Jewish press for intermarriage. They were statistically more likely to enter into a mixed marriage, and they were seen as being selfish. And they were faulted for leaving their female co-religionists with fewer options within the Jewish marriage market, and thus forcing them to look beyond the confines of the Jewish community to find a partner. Others blamed Jewish men for expecting unreasonably high dowries, thereby forcing less fortunate Jewish women to seek a non-Jewish spouse. And finally, men were even accused of having looser morals. Women, too, were charged with being responsible for the perceived decline of the Jewish family, but this was slightly more common, certainly in the discussion of intermarriage in the French Jewish press. Writing on the subject in 1909, the longtime editor of the French Jewish journal Les Archives Israélites, Apotelate Prague, unequivocally blamed women for the phenomenon. He wrote, and I quote, "The ideas on women's emancipation that currently enjoy great popularity permit, with the tacit agreement of their parents, too cowardly to resist this disposition of their natural rights, young girls to follow their hearts as they wish, and for too many of them, a difference in confession would not hinder their choice." Though he conceded to the various challenges that young Jewish women faced when looking for a Jewish husband, he nevertheless focused his criticism on women, the women's movement, and the decay in patriarchal authority. And his criticism of the women's desire to follow their hearts also underscores another palpable change in behavioral patterns that raised eyebrows and concerns, namely the growing emphasis young Jews themselves placed on personal prerogative. In a later article from 1925, Prague continued along a similar vein as he railed against the independent spirit of the century that manifested itself in religious decadence and the abandonment of religious practices. At the heart of these worrisome traditions stood the loss of respect of one's parents, which had formed the basis for the Jewish family for centuries. And instead, he argued that the young generation's thirst for pleasure prevented them from performing the critical fifth commandment and led to this decline in religious practices and a decline in morals. Not unlike Prague's criticism of the changing social habits, a number of commentators, both in the French Jewish and the German Jewish press, pointed to new cultural and social norms as contributing factors in the rising intermarriage rate. In an article from 1917, Rabbi Max Eschelbacher broadened his criticism of the social practices of contemporary German Jews to include the growing instance of women's paid work, longer periods of bachelorhood among men, and no less importantly, the nefarious influence of cafes, cinemas, and other sites of leisure. "We need only step into a big city cafe and immediately we see the root of this evil," he intoned. And in a speech at the B'nai Brit Lodge in Berlin in 1919, Gustav Löffler argued that the very survival of Judaism depended on defeating the threats of falling marriages and fertility rates, changing sexual mores, and the growing number of intermarriages. He declared that Jews needed to defend themselves against, quote, "the sensuous stimulants of over-refined urban culture." So sociability in the modern city was believed to pose a fundamental danger to the morality of good Jewish men and women. And so with this in mind, it's really, in many respects, ironic that other members of the Jewish community adopted elements of that same leisure and consumer culture to resist intermarriage and encourage endogamy. Parents, family members, and numerous community members did not simply or passively fret over the rise in intermarriage rates. By the late 19th century, many families, matchmakers worked hard to stop this apparent assault on tradition and sought to perpetuate the institution of arranged marriages by harnessing new leisure spaces and new media. And to these ends, a relatively novel development in the Jewish press was quickly harnessed to help continue the practice of arranged marriages. Beginning in the late 19th century, extended family members in Germany and a little bit later their co-religionists in France began to place personal ads for young relatives in the Jewish press. Announcements made for Jewish women at the turn of the century really continued the practice of arranged marriage, even in the various matrices that we imagine were necessary for it. They concentrated on advertising what the extended family deemed to be the most salient qualities of the hopeful brides, according to the logic of traditional marriage. These included responsibility in business and household affairs, standards of morality or religiosity, often phrased as from a good home, beauty, blondes, by the way, and a dowry befitting the woman's socioeconomic background. One succinct example read, quote, "A strongly religious match is sought for a beautiful girl, 20s, with 10,000 mark dowry." Regardless of the precise wording of these ads, the financial state of the future couple always took precedence. And ads for Jewish men also continued along the same pattern of preserving arranged marriages. The information that we get through them focuses on his economic status, and most of the ads focused on the description of the desired qualities of the sought-after bride, which were very frequently amounted to an expected sum of the dowry. And in most cases, the interests of the extended family clearly superseded the tastes and desires of the young individuals to be married, meaning that physical descriptions of the potential bride or groom were frequently and noticeably absent. Instead, level of religiosity was deemed to be a much more relevant characteristic. This was not always the case, however, and this ad that I'll read from the Israelitisches Familienblatt from 1905 offers further details. Looking for an appropriately aged match with a dowry of 25 to 30,000 marks for a relative. A 30-year-old able businessman who for the last 5 years has run a well-earning wholesale business in Berlin. However, he's not tall. Women of average height with a domestic, modest sensibility and a religious upbringing are preferred. And again, this ad stresses the economic status of the man, highlighting both his present condition but also his future earning potential. And it places attention on the quality of the bride, in particular her domesticity and religiosity, and that is not unique for these ads or for what was expected of the Jewish marriage market at the time. What makes the ad amusing, however, is also what made it atypical, because we don't tend to see much attention given to a man's appearance. Nonetheless, the ads, in ever-increasing numbers, helped Jews in Berlin and across Germany to make appropriate matches for their children at a time when Jewish youth were testing communal norms and boundaries. And other parents and family members turned to the same leisure habits that certain writers in the Jewish press had condemned, but to opposite effect. Seeking to reconcile the changing times and tastes, including the explosion of new leisure spaces towards the end of the 19th century and the growing desire of young Jews to exert their own autonomy, with the desire to ensure good and appropriate matches, across Germany, family members would orchestrate meetings between young Jews to make it look as if they had met by chance. Arranged marriages were thus covered up, and young couples were allowed to meet in the first time in a cafe, a restaurant, in the market, at the home of a friend or an associate, at a ball, or while on vacation. And in this way, families could still oversee their children's courtship, engagement, and marriage, but in such a manner that a quieter and more modest form of matchmaking developed, permitting the creation of a myth, namely that the relationship had developed out of love and not through the intersection of a matchmaker or the extended family. And one of the most interesting examples of this kind of practice was the use of holiday society and charity balls as a popular means in Paris and Berlin to promote endogamy. And from the late 19th century until well after the Shoah, in fact, charitable and holiday balls, especially for Hanukkah and Purim, were central events on the local Jewish community calendars. And balls were not simply upscale bourgeois events organized by men's or women's groups. Instead, their popularity spanned class, political and religious divides. Students, the working class, and different political and religious movements held balls for different causes and to different ends. And what is also fascinating is the degree to which religious leaders in both Paris and Berlin, including observant and Orthodox rabbis, condoned the events by their very presence and by the prominent role they played at these events. Many gave speeches, others even participated in the dancing. Thus, despite any halakhic reservations mixed gender could or should have perhaps posed, balls became popular among a wide cross-section of the Jewish population in both Paris and Berlin for fundraising, for promoting political and charitable causes, and because they were fun. They appealed to the youth culture that was emerging. And given the age of the numerous participants, balls organized by Jewish organizations effectively functioned as a chaperoned Jewish marriage market, and a select one at that. After all, balls were not infinitely open to all members of the local Jewish community. Economics and politics were important fault lines that separated between various subgroups. For example, in Paris, young women of the better classes who had come to the marrying age, roughly around 19, would attend society events in the company of their mothers. And these included balls held by the Friends of Jacob that took place every year at the Hôtel Moderne. Such society balls brought together elites of the community, winnowing the potential marriage market to an already suitable set of suitors. And in this way, 5 minutes, okay, we're good. In this way, balls served as sites of exclusion and inclusion. They brought together a Jewish audience and in so doing promoted endogamy, using specifically Jewish social and leisure spaces to curtail the influence of more open leisure spaces. And at the same time, balls had the power to exclude politically or socioeconomically undesirable individuals from their midst. Ticket prices or political agendas, both Zionists and anarchists held balls, helped control the choice of the attendees. And despite certain voices that had decried the morally questionable practice of mixed gender dancing and the larger dangers involved in participating in frivolous leisure activities, there's no small irony that, in fact, that such balls were ultimately conservative efforts to maintain the social order within the Jewish community and support endogamy. And in a time when personal choice was seen as a threat to order and stability, especially among the older generations, participation in new leisure activities like balls could actually help maintain traditional marriage patterns and this patriarchal order. And here was another reason for their acceptance. Already by the turn of the 20th century, young Jews were placing greater importance on personal choice and could enjoy an expanding leisure culture that permitted young Jews to follow their own tastes and interests. And while the economic instability and inflation that had followed the Great War, with the economic instability and inflation that had followed the Great War, family fortunes were ruined, and with them the potential to provide dowries for young female family members. The widespread practice of arranged marriages effectively came to an end on a large scale. Yet parents' desire to encourage endogamy and also the desire of young Jews to marry a co-religionist did not go away, and such balls allowed young Jews to meet someone who suited their individual tastes, but also guaranteed an endogamous match. And indeed, balls and dances had become so commonplace and so well known that by 1930, when the editors of the Paris-based Univers Israélite received a letter ostensibly from a Jewish mother who called and who wrote in and complained about the apparent absence of balls to promote the Jewish marriage market, apparently ignorant of the phenomenon, the editors even questioned the authenticity of the letter. Incredulous, the author of the short response listed a couple of associations in Paris, including the Union Scolaire, an organization for the city's youth, which held such dances, and noted that these were events that were even, quote, honored by the presence of representatives of the rabbinate, end quote. And this brief example suggests the extent to which balls and dances had become recognized as popular ways to promote endogamous marriages. And a number of youth movements also took it upon themselves to foster and to encourage mixed gender sociability. And the B'nai Brit joined forces, and one of the things that they had already started to do at the end of the 19th century was to try and create homes away from home. And by the 1920s, they were organizing dances as well. And for the issues of time, I'll jump over that just to let you know that there were a number of these such organizations that started to continue. Other organizations joined forces. And there were other organizations that were youth-focused that weren't just about dancing. A number of the youth movements that emerged in the early 20th century too ended up becoming basically unavoidable spaces in which young men and women interacted and in that sense fell in love. And Robert Gambzon, the founder of the first scouting troop in France, the Israelite Scouts of France, met his later wife Denise in the late 1920s through the same organization that he actually founded. And whether at times intended or not, mixed gender sociability was bound to foster romantic relations made through autonomy and individual consent, but in these cases always for and by Jews, and that was one of the reasons why parents continued to encourage their children to be part of these. Personal ads in the Jewish press also came to serve individuals who sought out for themselves endogamous unions. By the 1920s, more and more ads expressed the desire to enter into a marriage of choice and affection. And in the German Jewish press, they even had their own terms for this: Neigungsehe, marriage of affection, or Selbstinserent, an ad placed on one's own behalf. And these become increasingly common in the 1920s. There was even a palpable change in the wording that really stressed the greater importance of finding the sort of perfect match. And one from the 1927 read, "On my own behalf, a businessman, 34 years old, handsome German citizen with his own debt-free cigar store in Berlin would like to meet a beautiful, thin, business-minded lady for the purpose of marriage. Somehow women have to become thin by the 1920s. It's really blonde earlier, well, blonde stays, but thin becomes very important throughout, even during the late 1930s, which becomes disturbing. And with these, okay, so I'll just wrap up. There are a number of them, also examples from the French press and from the German Jewish press that really point to this growing interest in finding and taking advantage of what the city had to offer and taking advantage of what the modern city had to offer. And so in conclusion, while intermarriage rates in interwar Paris and Berlin did rise, both cities were equipped with concrete leisure spaces and a thriving press which provided context for the creation of self-determined and autonomously chosen endogamous marriages, unions wherein personal taste and attraction, shared values and faith cemented the bond between two individuals. As much as commentators in the Jewish press and sociologists of the time might have expressed considerable anxiety about intermarriage rates and the nefarious role that leisure spaces of the modern city played in pulling apart the very fabric of Jewish society, others sought to harness the very same innovative spaces and media to encourage endogamy, and they appear to have done so to no small success. Thank you.